A very warm welcome on behalf of the Atlantic Commission to this evening's discussion. We've got a full house, and I think it's good news. People are interested in what happened, and I think that's relatively important. I'm going to give you a very quick introduction in a second, and then we'll have two perspectives on enhanced forward presence. One from the Canadian side, by Professor Leuprecht, and then the second by Dutch Major Ruud Lenoir. The Pew Research, an American research institute, when they asked in 2014 nations of NATO partners, when a NATO country, not your own, is attacked, do you believe your nation needs to go and help? Basically, they asked, do you think Article 5 applies? In 2014, there were only 2 nations where the majority of the population answered that question with yes. And both these countries were not in Europe. Only Canada and the United States. In 2017, the survey was done again. Now there are 5 nations where the majority actually says yes, and the Netherlands with astonishing 72% answering the question with yes. The second is transatlantic. And let's be very blunt about this, the transatlantic link is, well, there is discussion. The President of the United States has called NATO obsolete. I think tonight we're going to talk about the Baltic states primarily, where there is clearly and visible a geographical threat again, which for most of Europe, when the wall came down in 1989, was something that we were never going to see again. But of course, in the same time, you also see a different threat, also by Russia. Let's call it hybrid, or whatever else you want. The influencing of our elections, the economic pressure through gas. President Trump's comment of Germany being completely dependent and therefore no longer neutral on Russian gas. And tonight we're going to talk about a small part of this, the enhanced forward presence. NATO's initiative to make sure that we are physically on the ground in the states that are directly confronted with Russia. And the question to the speakers, and that's the challenge they will face this evening, is how does that then contribute to these 3 elements? To commitment, to the transatlantic link, and to certainly, in a large extent, to deterrence in the form of security.
So the key about the enhanced forward presence is that it's NATO member countries assisting another NATO member country, but not strictly under a NATO command. And so in that sense, it is a completely new model for deploying NATO troops. One of the things we learned from Afghanistan, and also to a lesser extent from Iraq, is that we need to learn how to work together and to work together better and more effectively in terms of interoperability, communications, whatnot. If you can see what sort of the actions in Crimea and Ukraine have already precipitated here, that in itself, I think, is a strong signal to Russia that it may want to be rather thoughtful and prudent about what its next moves might want to be. There's already been considerable reaction to the moves that Russia has made, and so it's not clear to me that Russia is really interested in sort of a strong, long-term, sustained engagement, in particular with NATO. Sure, Russia has mobilized its own armed forces, but can it actually sustain that high sort of a tempo of engagement? Such an engagement could easily get out of hand. It could involve nuclear weapons. So I think we can sort of find sort of a balance here. And that balance looks, I think, in part in what's driving Canada's commitment. And it's not just a commitment, it's an investment. It's an investment in a situation that I would say is relatively low risk and pays relatively high dividends. So for Canada not to do this would come at a much greater cost than for Canada to actually do what it's currently doing, which is to provide headquarters capacity, which was critical because there are only so many countries within NATO that can provide that headquarters capacity. And in the circumstances, it was integral that Canada stood up and participated, because we probably wouldn't have had an enhanced forward presence if Canada had not. I've criticized Canada and other NATO member countries for not spending 2%, but 2% is really an arbitrary figure. What it ultimately comes down to is, what are you willing to provide, and are you willing to commit those capabilities where it matters? So I think there's 3 fundamental alternative futures that we might be seeing playing out with regards to the Baltic states and Poland and the enhanced forward presence. One is the status quo, that we essentially keep on going with what we've been doing, and our Prime Minister committed to 4 more years of Canada as a framework nation in Latvia. Another is that Russia might up the ante. This might get more difficult, because then When someone like President Obama comes to Ottawa and asks for Canadian contribution, it's relatively easy for Canadian governments and for the Canadian public to support that. When someone like President Trump comes around and asks for more contributions, it becomes a little bit more difficult for our politicians to sell that. But nonetheless, I think if Russia upped the ante within the region and it turned out that we needed more assets to have that credible deterrence, that Canada would ultimately step up, as difficult as that might be. The problem is the sort of assets that we would have, only the Americans would really be able to bring to bear. So these would be anti-aircraft defense measures, surveillance measures, precision long-range fire capability. So it's not quite clear what the rest of the alliance would be able to bring to bear here. But the real risk in terms of for alternative future is either US disengagement or US defection altogether. So we might see defection from the NATO alliance, and part of the reason why, of course, we're engaged in the Baltics is precisely to avoid that sort of defection, to make sure that the United States remains committed to Europe and remains committed to NATO. We might also see the United States getting distracted with other theaters, whether that's China or North Korea or elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific sort of region. And so the real issue here is making sure that we can continue to keep the Americans' eyes on the ball when it comes to Europe, when it comes to NATO, and so the Baltics and Poland in the enhanced forward presence are one of a number of instruments that we have to make sure that we keep the Americans interested and engaged in Europe, regardless of what might transpire elsewhere in the world. So how might we proceed from here? So I think we have a variety of options here. And so I would suggest that we need a hedging strategy. A hedging strategy that basically proceeds as if Russia were a defensive actor, but that is also sufficiently robust just in case Russia turns out to be a predatory actor. So here's some of the things that I think we will want to be doing. We want to make sure we engage, we do better, we improve early warning. So that in particular requires intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. We want to engage in minimal deterrence through credible threats in the least provocative way. So what does that mean? So for one, we need to facilitate regional command control and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance cooperation. In particular, I would submit through joint headquarters. And we're starting to see this now develop in Riga among the 3 Baltic countries. We know that each of these countries has its separate sort of challenges. And so one of the things we need to do is improve synergies and collaboration. How do we want to deploy our forces? We need to make up our mind what kind of forces we have. Do we want to have combat forces or do we want to have tripwire forces? If you want to have combat forces, you want to concentrate those forces so that you can actually fight. But the greater risk is actually that Russia will do exactly what it's done in Transnistria, in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, in Crimea, in Ukraine, that it will try to grab a little piece of land somewhere and violate territorial sovereignty that way. And so the best way to avoid that is by actually spreading the NATO troops around rather than concentrating them in one particular location. But the real issue, and I'll close on this, is that I think we might have our attention wrong. We're all thinking about a large-scale Russian invasion. What Russia is much more likely to do is to continue to do what it's been doing all along, which is a sustained hybrid campaign, to foment unrest, to spread disinformation, and to engage in military provocation. We have 3 pieces of advantage. We have alliance and partnerships that the Russians don't have. They have one formal alliance, which is with Belarus. We have a qualitative advantage, in particular in terms of long-range precision fire, and we have time on our hands across this alliance in the way that our adversary does not. So why then are we in the region and deploying in the region with the enhanced forward presence? Is it because of threat perception? I'm not so sure. Is it because of defense spending and criticism by the Trump administration? I'm not so sure. Is it because we're being heckled by an American president to do more? I'm not so sure. What I think is really at stake here is a healthy and robust alliance, because we need a strong, ready, and capable alliance. And by Canada being present and the enhanced forward presence and the framework nations and contributing nations, together with the host countries, on the one hand, provide key value added to the alliance, and on the other hand, they enhance the status of all the member countries that are contributing with their various capabilities. And so that's, I think, ultimately the real rationale behind the enhanced forwards presence and what's driving it.
In July 2016, in the Warsaw Summit, it was declared by NATO to deploy rotational forces to the Baltics and Poland. What we see is what was already mentioned, a rotational force in Lithuania. I'm concentrating now on my experience in Lithuania. Every 4 to 6 months, we deploying a new subunit to the multinational battlegroup in Lithuania. And not only the Netherlands and Germany is doing that, but also the other contributing nations which are deploying their subunits to Lithuania. A battlegroup is, as I stated, a force in enhanced forward presence to deter, but to be a credible force, also able to defend if necessary. So to deploy military actions. So a battlegroup is also built with its capacity to do so. We had to integrate into the Iron Wolf Brigade. Iron Wolf Brigade is the mechanized brigade in Lithuania, stationed in Rukla, and was for us a complete new partner, of course. And they had to integrate, for them, a complete new partner. So in a very short amount of time, you have to be aware about each other's procedures, about each other's do's and don'ts, to make sure that you are well integrated in a new brigade headquarters. We have to train them in social media behavior. One side, leave your name tag, but stand in front of the camera, so that nobody can know who you are, but show that the Dutch soldier is pointing out in enhanced forward presence. On the other hand, it's also, of course, a chance for all troop contributing nations to show to the rest of the world, not only to the alliance, but to the rest of the world, how seriously we are taking our job in defending the territory of the alliance. If we talk about the rotation of NATO, it's a question, will NATO direct or react? And what I mean by that, by building a EFP battlegroup, if we depend on what the nations are contributing, it's difficult to plan a defense plan. So if you send one time the mechanized infantry battalion, the next time a motorized infantry battalion, the Iron Wolf Brigade has every 6 months another construction, another capacity. And for a military unit, it's then difficult to plan how to act with those capacities. The subunits and the troop contributing nations are training their subunits with NATO doctrine. And so we could easily, in a very short amount of time, meet a certain level of military missions.
And I think one of the things that Europe needs to wake up to is Europe is a superpower. And how can you tell? Because people are constantly looking to Europe to solve crises. And that's what superpowers do. They solve crises. And so Europe's going to need to wake up and step up to the plate and recognize that it has an important role to play, and it can't just do what it's done very conveniently on the cheap for the last sort of 40 plus years during the Cold War, and simply sort of rely on this American strategy of we want to shore up Europe by making Europe prosperous and harmonious, and so the Americans basically underwrite much of the cost of defending the continent. Because the shift in US defense policy and foreign policy that you're seeing is ultimately, I think, a shift that is not a function of the Trump administration. What was Canada's most successful peacekeeping mission? Its deployment to Germany during the Cold War. Because the US and Russia didn't go to war, and we kept the stability in Europe, and ultimately we won the day with the coming down of the Iron Curtain. And I think that's sort of the premise on which Canada is deploying to the Baltic states, that we might be there for a long time. But if we can stop Europe and Russia, or the US and Russia, from going to war, then that's a major payoff for Canada, because we'll all be better off sort of in the end.
I'm struggling a little bit to sum everything up. But I'm going back to what I started with. So on the commitment, I think we now agree that commitment, actually physically showing on the ground that we are doing something, is, in my opinion, the most important one. Too lenient, well, we are actually deploying forces. So we're actually doing that. We are calling it a deployment as well. It's a strong message, and we think this is more important than anything else. And maybe we also now see a small shift from Article 5 to Article 3 of the NATO Treaty. It is about helping others defend themselves.
We've heard from Professor Leuprecht the academic view of why Canada is engaged in the Baltics. Now you'll be hearing a little bit from the government point of view. I'm happy to say we mostly coincide, actually. So that's very refreshing to know. Canada has participated in every NATO operation since the founding of the alliance almost 70 years ago. And it's because of these principles that our Prime Minister announced in Latvia this summer the extension of Canada's contribution to NATO's EFP through Operation Reassurance for another 4 years, as well as an increase in the number of Canadian Forces members deployed there.